Today was the first of our series of interviews with Andy Gibson from the CheltenhamTrail.com as we discuss some of the eye-catching performances from the start of the national hunt season. What do you think are the most important factors involved in making money when betting?
Well, clearly there are many factors, and I'll do my best to cover one or two factors that are particularly important to me. I think a good starting point is always knowing or trying to guess when to forgive a performance, an apparently bad performance. If we look at Lisnagar Oscar, he ran at Chepstow in the middle of October. It was his chasing debut. He jumped and travelled really well. The only thing missing from his performance was the one next to his name. From my eyes, he certainly would have won the race if he hadn't got close to the last fence. He lost ground and momentum. I imagine that his connections were absolutely thrilled with that performance. For me, it augurs well for the rest of the season. And if we fast forward 20 days, he then was sent to Stratford over a similar intermediate trip. Stratford is a much more speedier track than Chepstow, I think. Tighter turning. I don't think that played it to his strengths. The way the race developed, I think, was impacted upon by the fact that Black Op, the second favourite, Black Op, for some reason suddenly discovered how to jump a fence, and he was actually brilliant. I think this then created a situation where it was too much of a speed test for Lisnagar Oscar, and he really struggled, and his jumping kind of fell to bits. Now, personally, I'm happy to forgive him that run and mark him up on the first run, because I can see a very clear and definite reason in my mind as to why he struggled. So what we have is we have a single piece of evidence that says in the right conditions, Lisnagar Oscar is a very promising novice who travels and jumps well. But if you give him a speed test and you put him out of his comfort zone, like all horses out of their comfort zone, he's going to struggle and his jumping is going to fall to bits. Now, I often find that the most recent of those two performances makes too much of an impact in the betting next time. You might call it recency bias or availability bias. If we swap the two performances round, chronologically speaking, then he would be seen as a progressive horse. He had a disappointing start at Stratford and then improved markedly at Chepstow. This way around, he's seen as a regressive horse, and I think that's really going to help us the next time he runs in a novice chase. I'd like to see him run on a more galloping track, a Newbury, a Doncaster, certainly a track where the fences need jumping. I think jumping is going to be his strength, and I think he's a staying horse.
And what do you think might be his long-term target? What you're looking at Cheltenham, perhaps Aintree?
I think, one of the two. I think either the RSA chase or the 3 mile novice chase at Aintree, must be at the back of their minds. Yeah. Whether it's still on their minds after Stratford, I don't know. I'm not privy to any inside information there. If he was mine, I would still be looking there. I mean, he ran perfectly well at Cheltenham last year in the Albert Bartlett. I can't remember where he finished, but about 4th, I think. Yeah. That was a really good preparation for a novice chase career. Offers plenty of encouragement that he's going to be good enough to at least say finish in the prize money in an average RSA and be competitive. He wouldn't be my favourite to win that race, or he wouldn't be particularly on my mind to back him for that race. I just think that if he runs on a galloping track over perhaps 3 miles in the near future, he's going to be of interest.
So when you're making your notes on various performances, how do you know the difference between spotting the obvious and spotting the not so obvious?
Well, I suppose we only really get to find out when we see what how the market has responded to the horse in question the next time that we see him. Perhaps we might get a few clues along the way as well, because we'll see how much media coverage focuses on certain performances. That might help. If we go back again to the middle of October and the Silver Trophy handicap hurdle at Chepstow, this was a race run at a furious gallop. I thought there were a few performances to note, and the two I'll mention here are an obvious one, and what I would say was a slightly less obvious one. The reason I'm confident that the first one is a very obvious one is because I was talking the following day to a couple of other serious punters, and the only horse that we all discussed was Imperial Aura. Now, if we were discussing it the day after, I'm sure every man and his dog was discussing it the day after, so I think that was a standout performance. Imperial Aura in this fast run race spent too much time near to the pace. I think he was ridden in fourth place behind the three, or fourth or fifth place behind the 3 or 4 leaders. His jockey was very keen to get involved in the race at a very hot part of the race on the home bend. So I think he's endured the worst trip of any of his rivals in that race and has done remarkably well to finish third. So he was one I would be looking out for. Now, again, the issue with him might be clouded a little because I've just seen that he's entered in a beginner's chase at Leicester on Monday. So he might be another horse that's switching codes. Yeah. If that changes and he ran in a very similar type of handicap hurdle, I would be more confident that what I saw will translate to that race rather than a beginner's chase. But, we'll see on that score. Perhaps a less obvious performance was the one of Greenatine, the Paul Nicholls horse, because in my view, his 13 out of 14 finishes looks an awful lot worse than it actually was. He was quite keen. He still looked like he was going to get involved off the home bend before he then blew up. Now, at that point in time, a lot of the Nicholls horses were blowing up on their first run. So for me, he was only doing what a lot of his stablemates were doing, looking like he needed the run. I think there's a real possibility that the soft ground was not in his favour. I don't think we can be categorical on that because he's only had 4 runs for Nicholls. So there's not enough of a sample size to be sure on this. But at the moment, it's a point I'll monitor that maybe good to soft ground might be better for Greenatine than very soft ground.
Something in the spring, maybe at Aintree.
Possibly. Let's see how it's funny, isn't it? We say that, and then last year we were waiting for soft ground all through the heavy winter, and then we got it in the springtime. So just when he gets good to soft ground in a similar type of race, I suspect he's a well-handicapped horse, and he's certainly one that I'll be marking up next time.
So one thing I did want to ask you about was in the Betting People interview, you questioned the performance of Min at Aintree. Could you discuss a bit more about that?
Yeah, I do think that when a horse does something out of the ordinary, then inevitably that horse is going to be hyped for his next run. And the one thing that we can be fairly certain about is that he's going to be shorter than he should be the next time we see him. Now, in this instance, Min beat Politilog, I'm guessing, but I think by 15 or 20 lengths or something. And if we took that example literally, then who's going to beat Min? There probably wouldn't be a horse in training over 2.5 miles that would finish 20 lengths clear of Politilog on a normal day. But thankfully, we have 1 or 2 other pieces of information that tell us that Min actually is a very similar animal to Politilog in most cases. It's just happened that the way the race unfolded at Aintree showed Min in his best light and Politilog less so. So I think it's really important to question these performances. As soon as a horse goes past the post in like the best performance you've seen in a long time, the first question I want to ask is what if? What if that's not true, and why might it not be true? So if we look at a couple of examples, perhaps a little bit further down the class barrier, the class scale, should I say. Pacify won at Kempton in late October. He maintained his 100% record. Yeah. You can't argue, he's 5 from 5, you can't argue with that record. It's an excellent 100% record. On his previous run, he'd beaten the 125 rated the C. And on this race at Kempton, he beat the 125 rated Cardigan Bay by less than 2 lengths. Now, I think he's going to have to find an awful lot to compete with the better quality horses that he's going to come up against in the near future. I did some time comparisons that day with, I like to compare like with like on the same day. And I compared his run with that of Silver Streaks over the same course and distance. And the time comparisons support the likelihood of Pacify possibly falling short when he steps up in class. Yeah. It's not categorical, it's not a definite indicator, it's just one indicator amongst many. But the Evan Williams horse was around 6 seconds quicker than Pacify as they turned for home and maintained that advantage all the way to the line. I'm not too concerned myself about putting a number next to these timings. I personally prefer to be interested in what the time comparisons tell us about the sort of relative stories of the race. In this instance, I think this would point to Pacify enjoying a very comfortable time out of it in front, enjoying the run of the race and still only beating a 125 rated horse by a couple of lengths. So I would question him when he steps up in class. Now he's stepping up in class on Sunday if he maintains his entry. He's running in, I think it's the Sharps Novices Hurdle, the Grade 2 at Cheltenham on Sunday. I saw that he was trading at round about 4 or 5 to 1. Now whether that's a good price or a bad price will depend what the ground is on the day, what opposition stands its ground. So far, you'd have to question him on soft ground. You'd have to question, he certainly is unproven on soft ground. So if it came up soft, in an ideal world for me, I'd like to see him trading short. Yeah. And the shorter, the better. So the shorter he trades, the more likely I might be to want to oppose him. Now, conversely, in some circumstances, horses like this are suddenly available at prices far bigger than you anticipated, and in which case, you know, I wouldn't be averse to changing my mind and saying, well, look, although I have doubts about Pacify at the higher level, 25 to 1 is a ridiculous price in these circumstances, so I might tend towards him. But I think in the case in point on Sunday, I think it's quite likely that my preference will be for Pacify to shorten, and I'd love it if he, I sounded like Kevin Keegan there, didn't I? But I'd love it if he went off as the short price favourite against 2 or 3 horses that I thought were, you know, worthy opponents.
What do you think of the chances of him getting his race run to suit again?
Well, that's an interesting point, because that will also be part of it. It will be interesting to see, you know, I'll have a look at the Proform pace map. I'll go into more detail and make an assessment of whether Pacify is likely to lead all the way or have the opportunity to lead. If he enjoys an untroubled lead, then obviously that will seriously increase his chances of being successful. So once again, I'm hoping to find in the final entries that there'll be 1 or 2 horses there perhaps ready to take him on in the early stages and soften him up for some of the closers later on. I think another horse in point, a horse where I thought that his impressive looking performance was worth challenging, was the World's End, who won the West Yorkshire, the Grade 2 at Wetherby. Yeah. Excuse me. Now he made all the running and drew well clear in the process. Looked super impressive. He stayed on strongly from the last hurdle. Post-race talk of the Stayers hurdle, I thought it was rather premature. He'd beaten an 11-year-old whilst receiving £6. The third horse had been off for 735 days, was beaten less than 6 lengths, and he's rated 138. The favourite, that was Ballyandy, he didn't stay, clearly in the mud. Yeah. I'm not sure he'd stay anyway. 3 miles, he might, but he certainly didn't stay in the mud. I think the deep ground was also an extreme variable, which will not always be the case. Because the only doubt I had about him beforehand, and the reason that I wouldn't have considered him, was because he'd never handled the ground before. Now, post-race, although he's always needed a sound surface, post-race his connection said, well, now he's an older horse and he's, you know, stronger, etc., etc. We've heard it all, you know, we hear this many times. Now, this might well be an accurate opinion, of course. He might simply be better on the ground, and nonetheless it still leaves him with an awful lot to find to be troubling the better horses in a Stayers hurdle. If he does something similar next time, then it might be time to take another look. Particularly, I think, if he does something where he's held up and he comes through and beats horses. so that he's not just sort of a one-trick pony where he's leading all the way. I think he managed to win impressively in the West Yorkshire for 3 reasons. One, the extreme conditions. Now that's not something I would have thought before the race. 2, he raced on the outside away from the glue pot on the inside rail. And 3, due to being gifted an untroubled lead. Now that last point I think is a very, very important variable for him. And that's supported by his standout performance over fences last year at Cheltenham, when he was able to lead all the way in a small field and he won by a distance, and it was by far his most impressive performance of the season. A little bit more information on that day was that his trainer was in very good form at the time. He'd had 4 winners out of 10 runners in the previous 4 days, and of course that won't always be the case. Yeah. Now I see the World's Ends entered it actually in what was the Hennessy. I'd be surprised if they ran in that chase. I think that might be a bit busy for him up front. I think we're more likely going to see him in the long distance hurdle or the long walk hurdle next.
Yeah, that's interesting, because I assumed that would be a prep race for fences that run over hurdles, but obviously the way he's won, the connections have got a whole world open to them now in terms of different options, haven't they? But yeah, it'll be interesting to see where he goes.
No, and I don't think I disagreed with you before the race. I was open-minded on that point. And so it was interesting after the race. I think the owner came on and said fences clearly wasn't for him last season. Now, obviously, the Hennessy, or whatever the Hennessy's called this year, is that might have been a very early entry they've made from quite some time ago as a just in case.
Yeah.
So I think we'll see him in the long distance hurdle next, and then the long walk.
So earlier you mentioned availability bias, and I just wondered about the effects of hype and how you interpret that in your betting.
Yeah, I suppose we could look at 2 horses that are possibly heading for the Arkle in March. The first one, Thomas Darby, made his debut last week at Warwick. Now his trainer stated pre-race that he'd only win it if he could win it easy. He wasn't going to be beaten up. He wasn't going to be given a hard time of it. And this is also how it panned out in the race. The Dan Skelton mare went off very quickly, never came back to them, and he wasn't given a hard time in trying to catch her on the run-in. It was a perfectly satisfactory trial or debut of fences. There was, it was perfectly okay, and he gave the impression that he'll be better on another day, and obviously more vigorously ridden on another day. So clearly Ollie Murphy's playing the long game with his stable star, which means that his price in the anti-post market will inevitably develop in a different way compared with a horse that in effect shows his hand first time out. So that horse would be Fakir Duderi. Now he was super impressive. I don't know if you saw the performance, but he was brilliant at Navan on Sunday. He was promoted from 25 to 1 into 10 to 1 as a result for the Arkle, that is. And given that he's fairly likely to stay in Ireland prior to Cheltenham in March, that I think his price will probably shorten from its current odds prior to the festival. In fact, if I wanted to pinch a free bet somewhere along the line at the festival in the anti-post markets now, I'm sure there'll be a few less promising opportunities in the coming weeks than him. I can see him halving in price after the Christmas Leopardstown meeting easily, if things just go okay for him. But I think we need to question the performance as well, and also question the response to it, as we always should. So yes, his price will shorten, but how likely an Arkle winner is he? Well, I suspect the ground will play a significant role in this. If it came up soft again in March, I think it would be very difficult to see him finishing out of the first 3 or 4, even at this early stage of guessing. If, on the other hand, the ground turns into a normal, average type of Cheltenham, good to soft in places type ground, you might even see the trainer talking about stepping him up in trip. Certainly that looked on the cards once or twice last season when he looked a little bit slow for 2-mile races. I think the other thing to mention about the Arkle is he also might face a much busier lead on that day. Now you put the combination of a busier lead and faster ground, that's going to be a completely different skill set required from the one that he's shown so far. If we look at the horse he beat, Melon, well, what if Melon continues to get beaten, for example? You know, the form won't look anywhere near as good as it does right at this moment. Yeah. Another peripheral factor, Mullins had 2 other short-priced horses that dropped away on the same day. I don't think there's anything in that, but it's probably not relevant, but it's always worth keeping a quiet eye on matters like that. I'm not sure how good Melon is. I think that's also what I'm saying, and I'd like to see some proof of Melon. I think he's beaten, I don't know when the last time he won, but it was several races ago. I know he's been dining at the top table, but I quite often tend away from horses that run in the highest grade, never win, and then get dropped in class. I'd much prefer to see something coming up from a lower grade to the higher class, looking progressive. I think horses get into the habit of losing. Yeah. So for me, the jury's out still with Melon. As far as Fakir Duderi goes, I also want to remember how easily Thomas Darby went past him in the Supreme on soft ground, which would be Fakir's preferred ground. That was in the Supreme in March, on the same day that the Arkle's obviously going to be run next year. As I mentioned earlier, Thomas Darby wasn't ready for his chasing debut. He was certainly far from busy on the day, shall we say. He's available at 33-1 for the Arkle because his price is going to develop in a different way compared to Fakir Duderi. I've got no interest in getting involved in either horse at this stage, but I just thought the difference in their respective prices is quite interesting, especially given that, you know, history tells us we're only going to have 4, 5 or 6 contenders for the Arkle in an open year. And if nothing goes wrong for these 2 horses, they're probably going to be 2 of them.
So I know that you're not as big on working on pounds and lengths and working on ratings as some professionals. Why is that?
Well, the way I would look at it is if we only read a race using pounds and lengths theories, should I say, then all we can achieve is to unravel the race in the same way as the handicapper is doing. And this can only lead to backing the very obvious horses. I think it was that well-known horse racing man Albert Einstein who said something along the lines of, you can't solve a puzzle by using the same thinking used in its creation. And I kind of think that's probably quite significant here. I think there are many variables that are important, and when they're all permed together, there are hundreds of ways, different ways of looking at a race. I think deciding which variables on which days are the most significant is A, a very subjective job, and B, a very difficult job. And I'd rather not pin performances down to numbers only. That's not to say that I'm not interested in numbers. It's just that I think there are so many other factors that are equally or even often more important. I think if we take this path, this subjective path, we'll inevitably often find ourselves backing against the majority in what is, after all, a marketplace. So on some days, one variable might be the most important or even the only one that matters. For example, on an extremely heavy going, the variable of the ground might take more importance in my thinking than it would otherwise, because when something is extreme, it's much easier to filter horses out who won't handle something. So that would become very, very important. If we take the case of La Bagarrois in the Charlie Hall we mentioned earlier, I think the combination of very soft ground and the fact that she raced on the glue pot on the inside were probably the 2 most important variables in that race that I would be taking on board. Now, I am interested in ratings, but often because they play such a significant part in how a market is formed. Because to me, the rating itself is obviously not as crucial as how that mark was acquired and how relevant that is to the race in front of us today. So for example, if we look at the Lismullen hurdle, which was run on Sunday at Navan, where Bacardi's beat Apple's Jade. Yeah. Now, the probability is, after that race, Bacardi's will, well, almost certain probability is, will be due for quite a hike from his current mark of 152, having beaten the 162 rated mare, Apple's Jade, who was also penalised and therefore didn't get her mare's allowance because they were competing off level weights. Now, maybe with the mare it's significant that 5 of her latest 6 defeats have come in the springtime, possible. If we go back to Bacardi's, he'd been on a losing run of 8 races. He's unlikely to have suddenly improved leaps and bounds. It's possible, but highly unlikely. I think more likely that the mare, for whatever reason, is just not firing at the moment. Yeah. He's looked super impressive to the eye. He's beaten one of the superstars of racing on the bridle and drawn, I think he won by 9 lengths or something like that. So that's clearly, that performance is clearly going to have an awful lot of hype and attention attached to it, which hopefully will help us the next time he runs, because we've also got 8 pieces of information to suggest that he is a certain level, and we've now got 1 recent performance to imply that he is something completely different. I prefer the 8 pieces of information at this moment in time. Now, obviously, if he went out and did it again, all of this research is fluid and has to remain fluid. That's the way it is. It's ever changing, which is why it's one of the reasons it's so fascinating. Now, as for Apple's Jade, she's now on a losing run of 4 races, which, when you consider how she was hyped to be almost unbeatable 6 months ago or 8 months ago or whatever, that's quite a losing run. She's struggled on testing ground before, which might be a factor in why she disappointed on Sunday. She was kept busy for the early part of the race by Magic of Light, which I think may have softened her up for Bacardi's and therefore accentuated Bacardi's winning margins in the end and the style of his victory. But you'd have to say that Apple's Jade in her prime, Magic of Light wouldn't have got anywhere near her. It wouldn't have been an issue. Now, hopefully, she will return to her best the next time we see her. But what I would say is you'd want to be treading carefully at backing Apple's Jade at a very short price on the strength of those 4 defeats in a row.
And she's unlikely to represent any value given her connections, is she, and what she's done previously in years gone by.
That's a good point. It's the history of her form that will ensure, the history of her reputation that will ensure that if she should be 2 to 1, she's going to be 4 to 5. Yeah. And with a horse like her, it's going to be a dramatic difference in terms of where she is in the market and where she should be. Yeah. Now, obviously, the effects of that history will gradually wear off if she continues to disappoint. But I don't think we've got to that point yet, mainly because people will still possibly hang their hat on saying, well, the 3 defeats last year were because she's disappointed in the spring before. It's possible. Yeah. And this one, she simply needed the run like she did, I think 3 years ago, she needed 2 runs, one in Ireland and then she ran in the Fighting Fifth and disappointed. Yeah. Maybe it's another year like that for it. There are so many variables and so many possibilities, we can never be categorical on anything. Yeah. That's all for today's episode, but join us again next time for more analysis and anti-post pointers from Andy Gibson.